Welcome back. You only arrived this morning
from Australia.
From Australia. So welcome.
Morning,
Nice to see
thank you everyone. I'll just introduce my colleague Steve Milner, Development Manager with Panuku Development Auckland. And just before we go into the substantial part of this resolution, just a couple of points to note. These properties were vacant for some time. There's 3 properties which are in an adjacent part of the section, which are already in council ownership and have been declared surplus. We've continued to rent those out on a normal residential terms and conditions. The 2 subject properties, excluding Mr. Cheel's unit and his neighbour, Mrs. Devine, their properties are not included in what we've been looking at. The 2 subject properties, 56 and 57, Auckland Council Property Department made substantial efforts to find owners for these units as part of the Own Your Own scheme. They sat vacant for a considerable period of time, which Auckland Council Property Department didn't think was acceptable. There is considerable demand for pensioner housing, as I'm sure you're aware, but there wasn't a huge amount of demand here. I understand some of the concerns were some of the same ones raised by Mr. Cheel. There's an adjacent Housing New Zealand site that was previously pensioner housing and is no longer just pensioner housing. People who are wanting to move into pensioner type villages don't necessarily want families living next door to them. So there was considerable issues with rehousing or finding owners for these 2 units under the existing scheme. They sat vacant for a considerable period of time before Auckland Council Property Department transferred them to then ACPL and decided that their resources were best invested into areas where there is great demand for pensioner housing. I did at that time meet with Mr. Cheel and his wife and also their neighbour Mrs. Devine and had a cup of tea with them. At that time I said we couldn't talk about what the long-term future would be for these units until it had actually come to this committee for a decision. We haven't talked about rehousing into Amity projects as of Amity properties, as I've explained to Mr. Cheel already. That's very much what happens to those properties is up to Auckland Transport at this stage, so we can only act under instruction from Auckland Transport. So that has not been explored by us at all. We are more than happy, and we said this to Mr. Cheel, that given there is the offer back covenant in place where it must be sold back to council at 20% or with 20% less than market value. We have said that should these properties be declared surplus by this committee, we would be more than happy to look at options such as if Mr. Cheel no longer wants to be in this complex and his neighbour Mrs. Devine, we could look at rehousing them to other pensioner housing villages. We could look at buying them out. We could look at options such as waiving the offer back at the 20% less than market value. I've said from the start that we wanted to find out what the decision of this committee was in respect to the 2 subject units before we actually explored that. So subject to the outcome of today, more than happy to explore that with Mr. and Mrs. Cheel and Mrs. Devine, the neighbour. And I'm very aware that there's some issues that they're concerned about. Mr. Cheel has invested in solar panels for his property, and he's already mentioned that if he were to move, he'd like those rehoused. Mrs. Devine's mother is in a nearby retirement village, and she'd like to make sure she's on a bus route close to her mother. So those are things we can look at, but we didn't want to effectively put the cart before the horse and preempt a decision of this committee. So matters have very much been on hold until we've had a decision from this committee about what happens to the 2 subject properties. From there, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do you want to just run over the other 2 properties as well?
Sure. Just very, very briefly, 5 Raymer Place, Mount Wellington is residual land from roading works. It's been encroached on by an adjoining landowner. It looks like they've built a sleep out over the top of it. Due to the size and shape of it, it could only be sold to the adjoining owner. It is 420 square metres, but it's quite a long, narrow site, as you'll see from the photos. 39 Taka Street, Takanini. I presented that to this committee, I believe it was in December last year or February this year. 20 square metres of that property was to be retained for a cycleway. Auckland Transport have now advised us that that particular piece of land is no longer required for the cycleway. So just representing this to see if we can obtain approval to dispose of the entire site, so we're not dealing with two separate resolutions.
Right, thank you very much, Letitia, very clear. Questions, councillors, comments? Councillor Casey.
Letitia, I heard Brian talk about Housing New Zealand's master plan. What discussion has Panuku Auckland Development had with Housing New Zealand over the master plan in relation to these flats?
Councillor, the zoning of those is for terraced housing and apartment buildings. They haven't drawn up a master plan at this moment in time. But this site, it's a kind of corner slice, these 7 units, and they've got 51 adjacent. This is the corner slice, and they regard this as a significant acquisition if they're going to do something there. So clearly they haven't put time and effort into any redevelopment plan, because this is crucial.
Thank you. Councillor Crum.
Just acknowledging that we wouldn't have any legal right to ask Housing New Zealand to do anything with the site. I'm just requesting that either of you help us come up with some wording in regards to a strong recommendation that pensioner housing feature in this particular site, and I'd take your steer on whether that would be specifically in relation to 56 and 57 and adjacent units, or the site as a whole. I'm not quite sure what the wording should be, but if that's something that we could work on as discussion ensues, that would be optimum from my perspective.
Thank you, Councillor. And Madam Chair, more than happy for a resolution, an additional resolution B to be included in there, and for the current B to become C, stating that something along the lines of pensioner housing options for the entire site at 7 Rowlands Avenue be explored.
Yeah. Okay. Did you get there? Right. Okay. Councillor Watson.
Yeah. Just want to sort of clarify a little bit the offer that might come to Mr. Chiel and his neighbour in the event of this going through. So what you're saying is that you would be not quite going out of your way, but very open to accommodating some of these notions that Mr. Chiel put on with respect of waiving the 20% or allowing him to sell his house at market value?
We would be very happy at exploring some of those options. First thing we'd have to do is get advice from legal, so that we could work through that with him. My main concern would be not to create any obligations to council, while also ensuring that we acted in fairness with Mr. and Mrs. Chiel and with the other neighbouring landowner or property owner.
And that's obviously been discussed with him prior to today?
I met with Mr. and Mrs. Chiel and with Mrs. Devine, who's the other property owner there, and had a cup of tea with them some time ago. They were concerned at that time that these properties were vacant, that we hadn't been able to rehouse them. I said at the time that, and I completely appreciated their concerns about the Housing New Zealand site. I said at the time that we weren't able to actually work through options because we didn't have a decision of this committee as to what would happen with these 2 units. We didn't have the statutory authority essentially to deal with anything in respect of these 2 units until it had been brought to this committee. I undertook at that time, once we'd presented these properties to the committee, that we could then discuss any concerns that they had and work through options, subject of course to legal advice.
Okay, so I am right in assuming that this is quite this 20% deal is quite an unusual circumstance for council?
It's historical, but there are other pensioner housing villages such as this around the region. My understanding is no more are being implemented at this time, but the existing ones are still under operation. I also understand from Auckland Council Property Department that there's huge demands in other pensioner housing areas other areas where there are these pensioner housing villages, but not at this particular one. We did talk to, or I believe Auckland Council Property Department talked to Mr and Mrs Cheel and Mrs Devine about moving to another nearby complex that was in Panmure, but neither of the property owners were interested in that, and so that wasn't taken any further. And of course, if Mr and Mrs Cheel and Mrs Devine choose to stay where they are still the legal owners. That's entirely up to them, and they can do that. We're not dealing with those parcels of land today. However, they have come to us, they have approached, or they have raised that they have concerns about the fact that what they brought into was an entire pensioner housing village, including the Housing New Zealand sites, and that's no longer the case. I understand those concerns, and we're happy to do what we can.
Okay, so I'm you know, greatly encouraged by the apparent attitude here to accommodate them in some way.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm happy to move these recommendations if there's a seconder, but I am absolutely support B. Because I do think that when people make the commitment to buy into a place in their latter years, that's where they're hoping to stay and live out their lives with a right to kind of natural peace and quiet. And I think B is a little bit soft. I kind of think that if Mr Cheel and his wife and Mrs Devine decide to stay, that just saying that consider it, it could be quite unpleasant at times. I mean, we know that some of the places in my constituency, we have neighbours getting really upset about some of the behaviour of some of the tenants, and it's not what they should have to deal with. So I'm just wondering if there's something a little bit stronger that around consider not. You know, at least because if Housing New Zealand are owning those two other tenancies.
The properties which are in council ownership we currently manage, or Panuku Development Auckland currently manage. The majority of the site, as Steve explained, is actually Housing New Zealand
So I understand
managed,
that, but you're selling those units in that particular building, and the neighbours won't know what's happening and who's going to be there. And I think even if it's just that block, there needs to be some undertaking that there's other pensioners that are tenanted there or something like that, because I just think it's really tough, you know, when you're expecting quiet enjoyment and it's not what you get, and you've got noise and traffic and all sorts of other things that they will have no control over, no knowledge, and in a position of vulnerability. Approaching people sometimes in the middle of the night and things like that, and we know the kinds of things that can go on. So I'm a little bit concerned that we're just saying, oh, they, you know, it's a bit. I mean, look, they don't have to take any notice of it, but I think it needs to be understood that if we're disposing of these, that it's actually people that go in there will suit the neighbours. Put it bluntly.
In respect of the long-term future of the site, no decision has actually been made as to what will happen to the council-owned portion. Housing New Zealand have expressed an interest, but that doesn't mean it has to occur. There is a covenant in place where the two existing landowners, their properties will default back to council ownership sometime in the future based on the covenant. So no long-term decision has been made at this stage. We have been waiting until we've presented it to this committee before we actually engage in any forms of substantial negotiations.
Today a decision's going to be made.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really appreciate your concerns. At the same time, all we can do is suggest to Housing New Zealand. We can't force them to do anything, and my understanding is the biggest issue is actually coming from the Housing New Zealand properties, and that's why we completely appreciate the concerns of Mr and Mrs Cheel and Mrs Devine, and we would be happy to look at alternative options for them in the circumstances. We're under no obligation to do that, but more than happy to explore that in the circumstances.
Thank you. Councillor Crum, did you want to?
Yeah, understanding Councillor Cooper's concerns, absolutely, but it's a mixed environment now and has been for quite a while. And I don't know if it's prudent for us to insist as much as we can that Housing New Zealand make the entire site pensioner housing. It's going to be we will very much hope, a really good answer to housing shortages in the area for a mix of people, and of course the social housing element absolutely featuring. And so I would recommend that B does insist that the pensioner element is in the conversation, and that's what it's all that we can do, given that we have no legal right to tell Housing New Zealand what to do.
Right. Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. If there's no other... Sorry? Councillor Casey? You've spoken already, but carry on. You have spoken already, but
Might I
carry
speak
on.
again?
Yes.
Thank you. We're in a new environment with Housing New Zealand, and just earlier this week we have a governor-to-governor meeting with the board of Housing New Zealand, and in a way I'm sorry that we didn't raise this issue with them, because I think I'd quite like to hear from the Chief Executive, if he's here, with regard to what we can and cannot do now with Housing New Zealand. I know we can't tell them what to do, but we do have a much better relationship, and we've got an MOU with them. And so with regard to that resolution...
Yes. He's going over there.
Can you just, maybe for the councillors who don't know about the new environment we're working in, it's not the standoff it used to be, so I'm really hopeful for the future. But
we did sign off an MOU, and we have started to implement the various arrangements between the governance arms of the council and Housing New Zealand. We've had some very productive workshops between the executive of the council, the relevant CCOs and Housing New Zealand, and what we're focusing on at an implementation level is finding real things that we can do together in a practical and meaningful way, so that we discharge the aims and aspirations of the MOU by doing things together and learning that way. You know, my preference is not to, I guess, add or confuse the MOU by resolutions that keep adding to it, because we actually have a framework to have the discussion you want us to have in B. We actually have it all in place. It's still quite early days. You know, there's huge pressures on Housing New Zealand at the moment, particularly in Auckland. So I'm relaxed about B being passed, but it actually, we don't need to have the governance arm of the council constantly saying, we want this, we want this, we want this. The MOU provides the framework to have those conversations and discussions and take them somewhere, prioritising as we go.
Okay.
thank you. Can we change the word pensioner housing to housing for older people, just as just the seniors panel's here, and we need to use language that's age appropriate. My question is to Letitia, and I was listening very hard, and I don't know why you like. Lots of times staff come and they've made, you know, already, I don't mean made deals, but made progress, and you're waiting till today to go back to legal and to start talking with Mr. Chio. Why couldn't you have come with a proposal pending today's decision?
Councillor Casey, I mean, Letitia does a lot of work behind the scenes, and I think it's really careful not to criticise the way she works, because she works extremely well, and I know that she works very hard. So she wasn't able to do anything until we've made a decision, and with the amount of work that she does...
Forgive me, you could have got legal advice before today about the pending
with all
decision.
due respect,
She may not have needed to get... Hang on,
I'm happy to respond.
Excuse me, can I chair this meeting? Thank you.
We just said point of order. We're allowed to do that.
I just think that it's unnecessary. There is no need to expect staff to do work until a decision's been made by this council. They've got enough to do, I think.
Remember that one.
So we'll just rule that one out.
If I could just respond as well, until 11 p.m. last night when I flew back in from Australia, I didn't actually know that Mr. Cheel was definitely interested in wanting to move out of this property. All conversations that we've had is that he may want to, so we haven't progressed anything due to that. Also, I'm very, very mindful that we do have a lot of legal obligations with different properties, and my primary concern, I would rather take more time and not create any future risk to this council or to the ratepayers of Auckland by preempting something in any of our dealings. So I may take quite a cautious approach, but that's because I believe it's in the best interest of the governing body, Auckland Council, and the ratepayers of Auckland.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. I'm going to put it. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you.